Welcome to the show where we focus on matters of leadership and development in Africa. This week we're excited to host Under Secretary General of the United Nations and Secretary General of UNCTAD, Dr. Mukhisa Kituyi. We get your views on the issues. And as always, we have Africa's top 10. You're watching the Africa Leadership Dialogues. I'm Julie Gichuru. Dr. Kituyi has an extensive background as an elected official, an academic, and a holder of high government office. He also has a wide-ranging experience in trade negotiations and in African and broader international economics and diplomacy. He studied political science and international relations at the University of Nairobi and at Makerere University. He went on to earn a doctorate in 1989 from the University of Bergen, Norway. Dr. Mukhisa Kituyi was Kenya's Minister of Trade and Industry from 2002 to 2007. Let's get his views on the issues. Thank you so much for making time to be with the Africa Leadership Dialogues.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. You have a critical role that you play, spearheading the effort to ensure that developed countries are moving forward at UNCTAD. Can you tell me, when you look at Africa today, what are your candid feelings about the state of the African continent? And where have we failed? Where have we succeeded?
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, when you look at Africa, there is a blend of optimism and pessimism. On the positive side, we are seeing an Africa which is much more assured. And that's always important, the sense of self-belief. If you look at Africa Developing Agenda 2063, it's a continent-driven process where Africa defines its destination. Africa takes stock of its strengths and its potential. And Africa starts candidly addressing governance challenges, which in the past was kind of anathema that you could not talk about. Similarly, we've seen the phenomenal growth of sophistication and competence of the African human resource, which is playing a great role both in public and private sectors, domestically and internationally. We're seeing the foundings of a great African narrative for the future, with the potential of converting our demographic dividend into an international competitiveness. This is going to be based on certain assumptions. One is our main failing. The failure to create a predictable political dispensation in many countries aborted democratic experimentation, the untamed monster called corruption, and strife. When you see the collapse of the state and the long-term consequences, when they talk about Somalia, Central African Republic, or you're talking about resurgent crisis, often driven by domestic weaknesses in governance in places like Eritrea. The cost, the reversal of gains is phenomenal. The cost in expelling human capital. Like you look at little Eritrea, which is throwing out the largest per capita number of immigrants in the world.
So you've taken us through the positives and the negatives. Let's take a look at African leadership for a moment. Right. What kind of a leader do we need in our African states? What capacity, what characteristics would you say an African leader needs in the world today?
A leader cannot be able to do everything. I think the most important thing for a leader on any country, African or not, is to appreciate the importance of informed opinion. A major failing of African politics is top policymakers are more amenable to advice from their political advisors than to technical advisors. They are more excited by intrigues about conspiracy theories, so and so is planning to overthrow you, than the reality that there are certain resource talents that we have not sufficiently developed. So just a developed capacity of listening to informed advice. Number two, a leadership that has a vision to raise the ceiling. Many times you'll be content that we are doing fine because we are better than our neighbor. And when your neighbor is pretty bad, it means you set yourself very, very low targets. So a heightened African ambition, a sense of self-trust, and an ability to conquer the pettiness of corruption and such biases. But also a historical responsibility that after the decade of Africa, after the half century of Africa, it is time to move on to the next level, to sufficiently build a momentum that can compete with other areas, to wean Africa off the appetite of the gains of commodity dependence, and to look at the critical importance of confluence between innovation and investment, trade and export trade. These to me are critical considerations that are important for a 21st century African leadership.
So now let's look at that with now the lens of democracy and the fact that democracy offers all those who have the right to vote of age, citizens of a nation, the right to choose their leaders. Is perhaps the challenge the fact that we do not prepare leaders for leadership, and if we did, things would be better? I ask this particularly because you have been in the political sphere, and so you've seen the inside, the inner workings of political machinery, and you've been outside in the development world, in the global arena as well. What are your thoughts on this?
First of all, I think we should avoid the temptation to have a fetish about democracy.
What does that mean?
What does it mean? Two things. First of all, democracy is not an end. It should be a means to another end. Politics is supposed to be a vehicle to economic progress. But in many countries, we sacrifice economic progress to the end of political success. So democracy, as has been said, it's the most expensive form of choosing a government. The most important thing about democracy is supposed to be reduce the cost of succession. That we don't go to ancient pharaonic Egypt where all the artisans and technical people who had helped the pharaoh to build his empire are killed and buried with him, so that the next pharaoh starts from scratch because of fear that others will steal your patents. Democracy is supposed to reduce the cost of succession. But in Africa, you have democracy and succession challenges. In some countries, you have seen the heightened cost of political competition. Sometimes GDP gets a knock because of the polarizing influence of people exercise democracy in a very African version.
Is it uniquely African?
I think until Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, it was mostly African.
So now it's becoming global.
Yeah, it's an African export to the world, maybe. But I think democracy is important. But democracy must serve a purpose, which is more than free competition between political ideas. We have seen in countries like Kenya, an overdeveloped political infrastructure of a democratic nature builds such a huge political bureaucracy that it's a drain on the resources that will otherwise go into development. Right. That you cannot build the roads and rails you need because you have a massive expansion of parliamentary and regional parliamentary institutions with their attendant egos. So democracy has to be defined within limits. To me, what Africa needs most importantly, whichever political route you are using, you need peace. You need predictability in succession of leadership. You need inclusive and fair leadership. You need to break the bonds of tribal or subnational consciousness and mobilization. You need to make Africa attractive to African investors first, to non-African investors next. You need to grow Africa to realize the dream it has been carrying for so long.
That is very powerful. I think, very interesting. Democracy is a means, it's not an end in itself. Let's look at the role that UNCTAD plays in the world today in this critical conference that is being held in Nairobi. It's a highly dynamic, fast-changing world.
Right.
What do you think over the next 4 years will be the key emerging issues, and how should Africa position herself to best address these issues? Globally, there is a big challenge we're having. Over the past 20 years, communication technology has created a revolution in denationalized production, what we're calling global value chains. That when you make a phone, for example, the central processing unit is made in Taiwan, the motherboard is made in China, the cover is made in Bangladesh, and the brand is owned in Silicon Valley. It's borderless production.
Now, globalization was heralded as a potentially great force that will massively produce wealth, which it has done. There are two attendant problems it has produced. There's a lot of wealth being created, but it's by fewer people. So there is wealth concentration in a way that the West had never seen before. So your GDP is growing, but the middle class is shrinking. Now, that is a model that's not sustainable. Now, together with this, because of the global division of labor in global value chains, governments have limited control over enterprise. International organizations register themselves in tax havens, then they come to you, you are competing for limited, a very competitive market for investment in your country. You do not have the technical competence to actually assess the value of what is being made in your own country. So there's a profit shifting by multinational corporations. So you start seeing more people in the developing world getting involved in the production of things that are internationally produced, but the returns to the state and to the society are diminishing. So these are challenges that new technologies with the potential for prosperity are leading to visible wealth, but inaccessible wealth.
Stay with the Africa Leadership Dialogues.
Dr. You've just told us we are the laughingstock of the world.
In some areas, not in all.
Not in all.
No.
Okay, that's good news, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Mukhisa Kituyi has been actively involved, or was actively involved in putting together the trade-free zone for Africa. He's been actively involved over many years previously in trying to build a common agenda among African states when it came to trade and negotiations at international level. Let's talk about that for a moment. Can Africa have a common agenda? Can we find a common voice? And why has it taken us, keep talking about Kwame Nkrumah, the vision has been there for decades. Why has it eluded us for so long?
First of all, like any vision, early visionaries paint broad brushes. They cannot have the little details. Details have to be filled in by people who implement. The great visions of founders of modern Africa like Kwame Nkrumah lacked people to paint in the details. And secondly, the betrayal of the hopes and aspirations of Africa because of Africa letting itself be divided by former colonial masters in different zones, because of the more rapid growth of appetite for personalized wealth that drove the greed by a certain wave of African leaders, still existing in some countries, though being conquered in some other countries. And the vagaries of extremism that we have seen bedevil some of the countries, these have been challenges. But I am glad that under the stewardship of the African Union Commission, the leadership of Africa has come to terms with the reality that either it integrates or it perishes. There's no model, there's no region of the world which has developed without trading first and foremost with its neighbors. Or as they say in Rwanda, history teaches us that those who do not trade with their neighbors, trade their neighbors. So Africa will find that greater commercial integration reduces regional animosity and builds the standards that will lift even the weakest and most vulnerable among us. I'm glad that the earlier phase of Kwame Nkrumah, followed by the phase of the Abuja Plan of Action and the Lagos Plan Agreement about 30 years ago, laid the foundation of what needed to be done. And now, more recently, we are seeing more concerted effort, first of all, by setting goals in the regions. The region integration efforts and the interlocking between the regions, like the tripartite now being negotiated between East African Community, COMESA, and SADC, and the CFTA, where ECOWAS countries were slow starters, but they're now building up momentum. Services sector, whether it's in tourism or in back office operations or in financial services like in Morocco, Kenya, and South Africa, Africa is doing very well, world-class, world standard. Of course, everybody talks about the story of M-Pesa from Kenya, evidence that African invention can find critical international use. And it's not just M-Pesa. There are lots of other African inventions which have been used globally for early monitoring of disaster that have made a difference to the world. Similarly, African scholarship is growing very, very well. You have an African intelligentsia that's world-class. Thanks to globalization, you find them manning all manner of places around the world. And third, though not uniformly, African politics is starting to evolve in a more democratic way, more predictable way, and crime is getting punished a bit more than before.
So we are moving forward in that regard, which is good news. Have to ask, Britain has decided that it wants to exit the European Union. I think for many people a shock outcome, which has huge implications in so many ways.
Right.
Do you think that there will be an effort to revive the grandeur of the Commonwealth? Do you think this will now start to interfere with the growth and progress that is being made in terms of integrating African economies?
First of all, the intelligentsia in British politics and British economy and British academy did not for one moment think seriously that the Brexit vote will succeed.
They're still in shock.
They're still in shock. And what does this mean? That positive thought sometimes is vetoed by fear. Brexit is driven by fear of immigrants much more than by economic realization of national strength. So Britain will have to pick its pieces as it walks through this, both in terms of the architecture of its international engagement and the political fallout with Scotland, particularly, and Gibraltar voting overwhelmingly for remaining in the European Union. But having said that, we should not cry other people's cry. In the short term, Britain will trade with Africa on the basis of the economic partnerships that were negotiated when Britain was part of the European Union. It will retain this structure until it has something new. But what it also means is now, Commonwealth, which was declining into a cultural organization, is going to have a new economic bearing since London can make decisions about market access. Before, British openings for African traders, for example, had to go via Brussels. Now for Africa, when you negotiate something new with Britain, in international trade negotiations, your punching power is how much market you represent. When Britain was part of Brussels, it represented 500 million consumers. So the punching power was much larger. When Britain gets out of the European Union, it represents 64 million consumers. So its punching power is much more reduced. But it also means that Africa's demands on Britain can now be stronger than when it was as part of Brussels. So in those terms, it's not a cause for alarm for Africa.
It is an opportunity.
It's an opportunity.
Right.
What exists as market access into Europe is not affected. The European Economic Partnership arrangements with Africa will continue as is. But what happens between Britain and Africa is that for the first time in more than 30 years, you can now tell Britain, we want more access to your market. Earlier on, they will hide behind Brussels. Right.
We're coming to the close of the interview. I have one final question. You've been out of politics for, 6-7 years now? Do you miss it at all? And if you had a chance to sit with political leaders across Africa, you had a gathering them in front of you, and you were speaking, gathering in front of you, you're speaking to them, what words of advice would you share with politicians?
Over the past 3 years, I've addressed nearly all African presidents at the summits of African Union Commission. So in terms of what I can tell them, some of the things I've already been telling them. I've also had the privilege to visit individually about 20 African heads of state in my new capacity. I don't miss politics as a career for myself, but I cannot downplay the importance of politics, because sound politics is critical for sound economics. Now, having said that, what I have to say to African leaders, number one, move away from the temptation of closing your eyes to the sufferings of your people because of the comfort of resource rents that you get from investors who are extracting from Africa. Number two, appreciate the fact that you have a unique privilege to be leading your people, but there's nothing unique about you to be leader. If you see your humanity, you'll be humble enough to say you have a call to service and time it knowing that somebody else will come and take over from you. Let the country that you lead be better when you leave than when you started. And number 3, Africa is not an island. We're competing in a very competitive international environment. If Africa does not put its act together, we'll continue seeing the shame that always bedevils us when we look at, for example, last month, in June, in Havana, Cuba, I launched the World Investment Report, 21st of June to be precise. And in that report, I was comparing foreign direct investment flows around the world. In 2015, foreign direct investment to Africa was $44 billion US. Foreign direct investment to Southeast Asia was $550 billion, more than 10 times. That is the challenge, that is the direction that African leadership should ask itself. What is it they are doing that we're not doing, and how can we get that act on the road?
Fantastic. Thank you for speaking to our African leaders. Now to close, I'll ask you to look back into the camera and give a message to all those who might be watching, wherever they might be in Africa. What role do we as individuals have to play in building the continent?
Thank you. To the people of Africa, there is no greater role you can play for your continent than a role first of self-belief. Be proud of your identity as an African and believe that the rest of the world cannot respect and appreciate you unless you show the greatness of being African. Africa has the talent, Africa has the natural resources, Africa has a great potential to be the pride and the envy of the world. But it's not going to be possible unless Africans believe in themselves and they believe in strengthening Africa, not using their talent to go and strengthen other parts of the world. I look forward to our next generation of Africans that has ridden out the negatives of my own generation and is proud in the community of nations.
That's so inspiring. A generation that's better than us. Better than us. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Stay with the Africa Leadership Dialogues.
My name is Dr. Mukhisa Kituyi. I'm an Under-Secretary General of the United Nations and Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And you are watching the Africa Leadership Dialogues. Thank you.
What fascinating insights. And those insights take us straight to your views on the issues.
This week we asked you, can Africa have a common agenda? Ifantas Wenyonyi says, the only way Africa can achieve one agenda is if all involved parties put aside their own interests and work together for the greater good of the population.
My name is Yoga David and I'm watching African Leadership Dialogue from Rongai. A common agenda is paramount if Africa is to realize sustainable development, and this can only be achieved if all parties involved put aside their own interests and work together for the greater good.
To join our conversation, go to our G+ page, Africa Leadership Dialogues, on Facebook, Africa Leadership Dialogues, on Twitter, @AfricaLD, and on WhatsApp, send your video comments to +254 715 816 033.
And now it's time for Africa's Top 10.
On Africa's Top 10 this week, we feature states with the best custom procedures. The aim of the research was to ascertain how efficient the entry and exit of merchandise is in a country, with 1 being not efficient at all and 7 being efficient. This is according to the World Economic Forum. Starting us off at number 10 is Seychelles with an index of 3.8 and is ranked 79 globally. Coming in at number 9 is Namibia. The Southern African country registered an index of 4.17 and is ranked at number 64 globally. Positioned at number 8 is South Africa. The Rainbow Nation attained an index of 4.19 and is number 62 in the global listing. Taking the number 7 spot is Botswana. The landlocked country garnered an index of 4.25 and is listed at number 60 in the global ranking. Zambia takes the 6th slot with an index of 4.28 and is ranked 59 globally. Slotted in at number 5 is Morocco. The country in the Maghreb region of North Africa attained an index of 4.35 and is number 79 in the global listing. At number 4 is Senegal. Known for its French colonial heritage and natural attractions, Senegal registered an index of 4.37 and is listed at number 56 globally. Anchored in at number 3 is the Gambia. The West African nation garnered an index of 4.6 and is ranked 42 globally. Coming in at number 2 is Mauritius. The volcanic island nation is listed at number 38 globally with an index of 4.7. At number 1 this week is Rwanda. The land of 1,000 hills registered an index of 5.2 and is number 16 in the global listing. And that's Africa's Top 10 this week.
As always, we end the show with words of wisdom. We have a very powerful African proverb for you. 'Tis better to walk than to curse the road. A lot of people who do a lot of complaining and whining, but they don't act. It's time for each of us as Africans to stand up and take our place and make a difference. The opportunities are there. We can overcome the challenges. Let's do this. Blessings to you and blessings to Africa.